kind of bring us back to where we began with this, the narrative that we're brought up with, which you call in the book the narrative of perpetual progress, or NPP. It seems to me, that at that point, as soon as you have agriculture, you have excess food by definition, and you get kind of whoever controls that food suddenly has power, right? So you get hierarchies, and then they are the people who get to tell the story that this is actually a really good idea and everyone should keep working for me. You slaves should feel really lucky that you're working for me. And then we end up even in the modern day with this narrative of perpetual progress.
Yeah, for sure. The only element of what you just said that I might edit a little bit is the extra food, because population grows so quickly that you always have starving people. And so you have this sort of Malthusian process where, there are always people who don't have enough, and there are people who have plenty. And so you get that sort of class system built into any kind of agricultural settlement. And the people at the top control the narrative, of course, control what's considered a legitimate complaint, or what's a possible, the realm of possibility in terms of change. I'm often reminded, I wrote about this in Sex at Dawn, my previous book. I don't think I talked about it in Civilized to Death, but there was a term in the 1850s, 60s in the southern United States, of course, where slavery was built into the economy. There was a medical term called drapetomania, which was, this was written about in medical journals, taken seriously. And it was a form of mental illness that struck slaves sometimes, that made them so delusional that they thought that they should be free, that they didn't accept the clear reality that they were inferior to white people and that they were lucky to be owned by white people. So it's like we're surrounded by this sort of thing. And of course, I'm sure we have many similar delusions in our present day. There's no reason to think we're free of them. But it's amazing when a lot of people would think of it as taking the red pill, right? Where you step out and you're like, oh my God, this is all an illusion. This is all, a system of interlocking lies and advertisements and propaganda. And it all fits together so beautifully.
Yeah, I think those delusions to me are the signal that, more than anything else, that the culture we're living in is not healthy. There's a signal that it's pathological in some way. I think a healthy person, a healthy culture doesn't have to have delusions that they hold on to. You hold on to a delusion because there's some intense emotion usually behind it, like fear or something. So you have to have it be a certain way. And in our culture, so my background is in kind of psychology and neuroscience, and when you're told things like depression is a biochemical imbalance in the brain that just is this purely physical thing, don't bother asking about their socioeconomic situation, don't bother asking about if there are structural inequalities, it's just this this malfunction. And then suddenly you as you describe, you suddenly see like, oh, wait a minute, this is a culture that's it's picked up so much momentum that the stories it tells and that honest people believe serve the culture rather than being in the service of kind of calmly, objectively looking at the truth. Because if we calmly and objectively look at the truth, then suddenly we're asking questions like, well, is the prison system justifiable given that, a lot of the people are there because of kind of structural inequities, and the culture doesn't want to kind of ask those questions. Instead, we're kind of stuck in this system of delusion and propaganda.
Yeah, I often think about that. I used to think about it all the time in my 20s when I was more involved with psychedelics and found psychedelics to be a very helpful teaching, learning aid, I guess we could say, educational aid. And, my experiences with psychedelics were so helpful and interesting and, literally mind altering in a very positive way. And yet I was aware of the fact that if I ever got caught with a pocket full of mushrooms or LSD or whatever, I'd be put in a cage, for decades.
Yeah.
Minimum mandatory sentencing guidelines passed in the United States in the 1980s under the Reagan administration specified, and this, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but for any of your audience who isn't aware of this, this means that a judge cannot alter the sentence. There's a grid. So if you have 100 hits of LSD in your pocket, that means that's for distribution. That means you go away for 10 years. And the judge can't say, oh, but this person has no prior convictions. This person's a model citizen, so I'm going to reduce it. The judges couldn't do anything. It's just a mathematical formula. And that was higher than the average sentence for second-degree murder. So people are still in prison in the United States for, selling magic mushrooms at a Grateful Dead show, a drug that's not addictive, that wasn't making money for Colombian drug cartels. There's no money laundering happening. It's just hippies getting high and listening to, what I consider to be not such great music. But people are in a cage. Their entire lives are ruined for that. So I often thought, why is every society I know anything about that had access to psychedelic substances consider them to be the greatest gift of the gods, sacred, and here we are penalizing them more than murder? What does that say? To me, that says we live in a society that doesn't want people to think, doesn't want people to see through the nonsense.
I think you're totally right. I mean, if you look at the kind of history, it's, the proximate cause of the kind of aggressive clampdown rate seems to be that people were unwilling, more and more young people were unwilling to fight in Vietnam, fight these unjust wars. But behind that is what you're saying. It's a perspective difference. You've got the mainstream culture that's part of the narrative of perpetual progress, which is kind of marching forward in its narrative. And then you've got these young people who actually are kind of, want to kind of go live in communes and arguably in kind of egalitarian structures that do approximate these kinds of more naturalistic kind of hunter-gatherer. Obviously, they're not doing hunting and gathering, but they're taking inspiration from these ways of living, and it's resonating more. So yeah, I think once you've tried these substances, you can quite easily see that it is a war between these two visions of what humans should really be, right?
Yeah, very much. And you're right that, the communes weren't actually hunting and gathering, although they did adopt a lot of the, the fashion, the fringe jackets and the buckskin and the moccasins and, all that sort of thing. But they were very much about getting back to the land, about cooperation, about anti-consumerism and sort of a minimalistic approach to economic life. Timothy Leary famously said, tune in, turn on, and drop out, right? So a lot of it was about, hey, the values that this society is built on aren't my values. And of course, my personal perspective on all this, I often see things as hunter-gatherer versus agriculture. And so, the political divide, the hippies versus conservatives, is very much a hunter-gatherer versus agriculturalist approach. With the sort of hippie movement, counterculture movement being a hunter-gatherer value structure. We value friendship and free time and artistic creativity much more than we value how big your house is or how many cars we have or, washing machines and all this kind of business. So yeah, you can sort of see this struggle, which I think is maybe one of the deepest human struggles playing out in all kinds of places. Even the sort of political divides, between the, in the United States, it's the Democrats and the Republicans. And of course, the argument can be made that Democrats aren't actually what they pretend to be. But let's say they're, look out for everybody. We're all in this together, universal health care, tax the rich so that everyone has enough. This is a very hunter-gatherer, egalitarian set of values. Whereas on the other side, private property, this is mine, keep your hands off it. I have the right to resort to violence to protect what I own, all this kind of, that's very agricultural, stance. And so I see it's always the same struggle playing out again and again and again in so many different realms.